The roar of artillery, the thunder of tanks, the scream of dive bombers. These were the visceral, terrifying sounds of World War II, defining a conflict fought with unprecedented brutality and industrial might. For Adolf Hitler and his generals, war was fundamentally an art, a crucible of willpower, intuition, and tactical genius, executed through brute force and technological superiority. Their military doctrine, rooted in the swift, decisive blitzkrieg, emphasized daring maneuvers, the unyielding courage of the soldier, and the raw power of their war machine. They believed that victory would be forged on the traditional battlefields of land, sea, and air, where human bravery and strategic vision were the ultimate arbiters. But even as armies clashed and bombs fell, an entirely different, silent revolution was unfolding behind the Allied lines, a battle waged not with steel and fire, but with chalk and blackboards, slide rules and complex equations. This was a war fought in quiet laboratories, dimly lit war rooms, and bustling statistical units, a profound shift in thinking that would fundamentally redefine the very methodology of warfare. Unbeknownst to the Axis powers, their intuition-driven approach was being systematically undermined by a new, relentless force: operations research. Operations research, or sometimes simply operational research in its British origins, was the application of scientific methods, primarily mathematics, statistics, and logical analysis, to complex military problems. It brought the rigorous discipline of scientific inquiry to bear on the messy, unpredictable realities of combat. Instead of relying solely on a commander's gut feeling or accumulated experience, or sought to find optimal solutions by analyzing data, building models, and predicting outcomes, it asked questions like, what is the most effective depth to set a depth charge? What is the ideal size for a convoy? Where should anti-aircraft guns be placed for maximum effect? How many bombs are truly needed to neutralize a target? This was a profoundly counterintuitive approach to many traditional military officers, who often viewed war as too dynamic and human a pursuit to be reduced to numbers. Yet, a desperate need for efficiency in the face of overwhelming odds forced the Allies to embrace it. Britain, fighting for its very survival, was the crucible where war truly began to flourish, bringing together an unlikely band of scientists, mathematicians, physicists, statisticians, economists, and even zoologists, to tackle urgent military dilemmas. Their work was shrouded in the deepest secrecy, often hidden under code names and compartmentalized from those who didn't need to know. For the Axis, this scientific approach to military strategy remained a complete blind spot. They understood technology. They built formidable tanks, advanced aircraft, and devastating rockets. But the systematic optimization of force application, the analytical dissection of tactics, and the use of probabilistic reasoning to guide battlefield decisions, largely escaped them. They continued to rely on a more hierarchical, intuitive, and often anecdotal approach to problem-solving. This intellectual chasm would prove to be a decisive, yet invisible, factor in the Allied victory. The story of operations research in World War II is a testament to the power of human intellect in the face of existential threat. It's the tale of how a secret formula saved countless lives, drastically improved the efficiency of Allied forces, and left Axis commanders utterly baffled by unexpected Allied successes. They witnessed the effects: unexpectedly accurate bombing, remarkably resilient convoys, deadly effective anti-aircraft fire, but rarely understood the silent, intellectual machinery that drove these improvements. This was the war's ultimate weapon, not always steel and fire, but pure, unadulterated mathematical might, deployed with devastating precision on the unseen battlefield of the mind. The genesis of operations research as a formalized discipline can be traced directly to the crucible of Britain's desperate struggle for survival in the early days of World War II. Unlike the United States, which would later join the conflict with vast industrial capacity, Britain found itself alone against the Nazi war machine in 1940. Resources were scarce, manpower was limited, and every single bullet, gallon of fuel, and aircraft had to be used with maximum efficiency. There was no room for error, no luxury of waste. This existential crisis created an urgent, unprecedented demand for smarter, more effective ways to deploy limited assets against a formidable enemy. The traditional military structures, accustomed to making decisions based on experience, intuition, and established doctrine, were struggling to adapt to the unprecedented pace and technological complexity of modern warfare. Commanders faced entirely new problems: how to best use primitive radar to detect incoming bombers, how to defend against U-boat wolfpacks, how to maximize the impact of limited bombing raids. The answers weren't in existing manuals, they required a new approach. It was in this atmosphere of desperate necessity that the concept of bringing civilian scientists directly into military decision-making began to take hold. These scientists, often academics from universities, were initially viewed with skepticism by some seasoned military personnel. They were nicknamed boffins, a term often used for eccentric or unworldly scientists, and their theoretical approach seemed far removed from the grit and grime of combat. Yet, the sheer inability of traditional methods to solve critical, immediate problems forced the military to open its doors. One of the earliest and most famous applications emerged during the Battle of Britain. The fledgling chain-home radar system, Britain's vital early warning network, was revolutionary but imperfect. Military commanders needed to know how to position their fighter squadrons, how to vector them most effectively to intercept incoming German bombers, and how to manage the limited time their fighters had in the air. A group of scientists, including physicist Patrick Blackett, began to analyze the raw data from radar plots and air engagements. This became known as Blackett's Circus, an informal but highly effective team attached to the RAF's Coastal Command and later, Fighter Command. Their work was groundbreaking. They didn't just invent new gadgets, they applied a scientific method to existing operations. They collected data on fighter patrols, bomber formations, and interception rates. They used statistical analysis to identify patterns, quantify probabilities, and build simple mathematical models of combat. Their findings led to crucial insights. Optimal fighter deployment. They recommended changes in how fighter squadrons were scrambled and directed, leading to more effective interceptions and better use of limited aircraft. Radar station placement. Their analysis helped optimize the siting of new radar stations to cover critical gaps in coverage. Improving communications. They identified bottlenecks in the command and control structure that hampered rapid response. These weren't technological breakthroughs in themselves, but operational breakthroughs. By systematically analyzing the data, the scientists could demonstrate, with hard evidence, what worked best and what didn't. They could quantify the impact of different tactical choices, allowing commanders to make informed decisions rather than relying purely on intuition. This often meant challenging long-held military beliefs, but when the data proved their points, the results were undeniable. The success of these early efforts, particularly in the Battle of Britain, demonstrated the immense value of operations research. It proved that scientific thinking could be directly applied to the messy, dynamic problems of war, yielding significant, life-saving efficiencies. What began as an ad hoc response to a national emergency in Britain would soon become a formalized, highly secretive discipline, fundamentally altering the Allied approach to warfare and creating an intellectual advantage that the Axis powers simply could not match. The Boffin War had begun, and its silent, mathematical victories would prove just as decisive as any on the conventional battlefield. With the United States' entry into World War II in December 1941, the scope and scale of operations research expanded dramatically. While Britain had pioneered the field out of desperate necessity, America, with its vast academic and industrial resources, quickly formalized and institutionalized or, applying its principles across every branch of its burgeoning war machine. The urgency remained, but the resources available for scientific inquiry and data collection grew exponentially. The American military, initially somewhat conservative in its embrace of civilian scientists in strategic roles, soon recognized the undeniable successes demonstrated by their British counterparts. The boffin concept quickly migrated across the Atlantic, attracting a new generation of brilliant minds to the war effort. These weren't just mathematicians, they were a diverse, multidisciplinary collection of intellects: statisticians, physicists, economists, biologists, psychologists, and even anthropologists. This deliberate multidisciplinary approach was crucial, as each brought a unique perspective to complex problems, often identifying variables and relationships that traditional military analysis might overlook. Within the United States military, dedicated operations research sections began to form. The Navy, one of the earliest and most impactful American or groups was established within the U.S. Navy. Facing the immediate and dire threat of the German U-boat menace, the Second Happy Time was particularly brutal on the American eastern seaboard. The Navy rapidly embraced scientific analysis. Their group tackled critical problems of anti-submarine warfare, convoy optimization, and naval gunnery. The Army Air Forces, AAF. The AAF also formed powerful sections, which were essential for optimizing the strategic bombing campaigns in both Europe and the Pacific. These teams grappled with questions of bombing accuracy, formation effectiveness, and bomber defense against fighter attacks. The Army, later, teams extended to ground forces, analyzing infantry tactics, artillery effectiveness, and logistics. The methodology of these formalized teams was consistent. They typically followed a structured approach. Problem definition: clearly articulate the military problem in scientific terms. Data collection: gather vast amounts of raw data from combat operations, after-action reports, gun camera footage, radar logs, convoy manifests, casualty reports. This was often a monumental task in itself. Model building: construct mathematical or statistical models to represent the operational environment and the variables involved. This might involve probability theory, queuing theory, or simulation. Analysis and optimization: use these models to analyze different tactical options, identify optimal strategies, and predict outcomes. Recommendation and implementation: present clear, data-driven recommendations to commanders, often backed by rigorous evidence. Continuous evaluation: monitor the implementation of recommendations and collect new data to refine the models and continuously improve performance. The impact of this systematic application of science was profound. It moved military decision-making away from purely anecdotal evidence "we've always done it this way" justifications, towards quantifiable, evidence-based strategy. The scientists were not commanding troops, they were providing commanders with an unprecedented level of insight into the effectiveness of their operations, allowing them to allocate precious resources more intelligently and to devise tactics that maximized their chances of success while minimizing losses. This formalization of operations research created a silent, yet powerful, intellectual infrastructure for the Allied war effort. It ensured that, as the conflict scaled up to an unprecedented global level, the Allies were not just fighting with more men and material, but they were fighting smarter. This new science of war would soon yield tangible, often surprising, results across every theater, leaving Axis commanders bewildered by an enemy whose efficiency seemed to defy traditional military logic. The battlefield was no longer just about who had the biggest guns, but who could best understand the numbers behind the fight. The true genius of operations research wasn't just in its formalization, but in its ability to deliver tangible, often life-saving, results almost immediately. In the desperate early years of the war, as Britain fought for survival and the U.S. entered the fray facing immense threats, teams were quickly put to work on the most pressing operational dilemmas. These early victories not only justified the boffins' unconventional approach but also began to give the Allies a decisive, if hidden, edge that consistently baffled Axis commanders. One of the most critical battlegrounds was the Battle of the Atlantic. The relentless U-boat campaign threatened to starve Britain into submission, and Allied anti-submarine warfare (ASW) efforts were struggling. Early depth charge attacks often seemed ineffective, and commanders debated the optimal strategies for convoys. The depth charge dilemma: one of the first significant problems tackled by teams, both British and American, was the effectiveness of depth charges. Naval tradition dictated that depth charges should be set to explode at the estimated depth of the submerged U-boat. However, analysis of post-attack data by scientists, like those in the U.S. Navy's Anti-Submarine Warfare Operations Research Group, ASWRG, revealed a shocking truth: a disproportionately high number of U-boats were escaping attacks where depth charges were set shallow. Their rigorous statistical analysis showed that U-boat commanders, upon detecting an escorts approach, would often dive rapidly, anticipating a deeper setting. The teams demonstrated that setting depth charges to a fixed, shallow depth, around 100 to 150 feet, regardless of the estimated U-boat depth, actually yielded a higher kill rate. Why? Because a U-boat fleeing a surface attack had to dive through the shallow explosion zone, and the shockwaves were far more damaging at closer range. This counterintuitive recommendation, supported by irrefutable data, directly challenged established naval practice. When implemented, it led to a measurable increase in U-boat kills and a profound shift in ASW tactics. The optimal convoy size. Another crucial contribution to the Battle of the Atlantic was the Orr analysis of convoy sizes. Conventional wisdom, and some early military studies, suggested that smaller convoys would be harder for U-boats to find and would allow for more nimble, evasive maneuvers. Naval commanders often advocated for breaking up larger convoys into many smaller ones. However, Orr teams approached this problem with statistical rigor. They analyzed thousands of convoy crossings, tracking U-boat sightings, attacks, and losses. Their findings were revolutionary. The number of U-boats needed to find a convoy did not significantly increase with convoy size. A U-boat was almost as likely to stumble upon a small convoy as a large one. Once a convoy was found, however, a larger convoy meant that the same number of escort ships could protect more merchant vessels. The ratio of escorts to merchant ships was key, and larger convoys required fewer escorts per merchant ship for the same level of protection. The Orr recommendation was clear and, again, counterintuitive to some. Larger convoys were safer and more efficient. This radical shift in policy allowed the Allies to transport more goods with fewer escort ships, saving precious resources and dramatically reducing shipping losses. This strategic change was a critical turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic, fundamentally altering the calculus of Donit's wolf pack strategy. Air defense efficiency. Beyond the Atlantic, early Orr efforts also optimized air defense. Scientists analyzed the patterns of enemy bombing raids and the effectiveness of anti-aircraft artillery. By understanding statistical probabilities of aircraft routes and the dispersion of flak bursts, they could recommend optimal placement of anti-aircraft guns, ideal firing patterns, and even better shell designs. These improvements, born from careful analysis of raw combat data, made Allied air defenses far more lethal, reducing losses to enemy air attacks. For the Axis powers, these sudden improvements in Allied operational efficiency were baffling. German U-boat commanders reported that their evasive maneuvers, once reliable, seemed less effective. Their pilots found Allied air defenses increasingly dense and accurate. They attributed these shifts to luck, or perhaps new, individual Allied technologies, never realizing that the very tactics of their enemy were being continuously optimized by unseen teams of scientists. This intellectual disparity, born of the Allies' embrace of operations research, was beginning to create a decisive, yet silent, advantage, fundamentally changing the nature of warfare. As the war escalated, Allied air forces undertook increasingly ambitious and costly strategic bombing campaigns against German and Japanese industrial targets. These operations involved thousands of aircraft, hundreds of thousands of airmen, and immense logistical effort. Yet, early bombing raids often suffered from low accuracy and high casualty rates, leading to agonizing questions about their effectiveness and the best ways to protect the vulnerable bomber formations. This was another critical domain where operations research proved to be a transformative force, revolutionizing both bombing tactics and bomber defense. The bombing accuracy conundrum. Initial bombing surveys revealed a stark reality. Despite massive efforts, bombing accuracy, particularly from high altitudes, was often disappointingly low. Many bombs missed their intended targets entirely. Orr teams, primarily those within the U.S. Army Air Forces, AAF, and Britain's Bomber Command, were tasked with understanding why and, more importantly, how to improve it. They meticulously analyzed bomb damage assessment photos, conducted statistical studies of bomb dispersion patterns, and correlated them with various factors like aircraft type, altitude, weather conditions, and pilot experience. Their findings led to crucial adjustments. They determined optimal bombing altitudes, ideal target approach vectors, and even the most effective spacing for bombs within a stick to maximize saturation. They also provided data that informed the development of new aiming devices and navigation aids, ensuring that these technological improvements were integrated into operations in the most efficient manner. By systematically dissecting the mechanics of bombing, Orr helped turn scattershot attacks into more focused, damaging blows, steadily eroding Axis industrial capacity. Bomber defense. The optimal formation. Protecting bomber formations from relentless enemy fighter attacks was another area of intense scrutiny. Early raids often saw heavy losses, and commanders experimented with various defensive formations. The scientists, analyzing gun camera footage, fighter interception patterns, and damage reports, sought to identify the formation that offered the best mutual defense. Their studies confirmed the effectiveness of tightly packed formations, like the famous combat box used by the Yuzov B-17s. While appearing vulnerable due to their density, analysis showed that the concentrated firepower of hundreds of machine guns in such a formation created a formidable defensive screen. A lone bomber was easy prey, but a group of tightly knit bombers could saturate an attacking fighter's approach zone with heavy fire, making it extremely dangerous for the enemy. Also provided statistical evidence for optimal spacing between these boxes and the number of escort fighters needed for different mission profiles, directly influencing strategic planning for raids deep into enemy territory. The .50 caliber effectiveness. A particularly striking insight came from analyzing the performance of the .50 caliber machine guns, the primary defensive armament of American heavy bombers. While many airmen believed that simply having more guns would increase effectiveness, teams looked at the probability of hitting and downing an enemy fighter. They studied the actual combat results, identifying effective firing ranges, optimal burst lengths, and even the typical trajectory of attacking fighters. This data helped refine gunnery training, emphasizing accuracy and short bursts rather than simply spraying ammunition, thereby conserving precious rounds and increasing the statistical chance of a kill. The sheer volume of firepower in a combat box, when optimized by principles, became a devastating deterrent. The fighter gap and escort optimization. Operations research also played a critical role in tackling the problem of the fighter gap, the crucial distance beyond which short-range Allied fighters could not escort bombers, leaving them vulnerable to German interceptors. Scientists analyzed the range capabilities of various fighter aircraft, like the P-47 Thunderbolt and later the P-51 Mustang, and their fuel consumption at different altitudes and speeds. This work contributed to the development of strategies for optimal escort rotation, mid-air refueling concepts, though not widely implemented for fighters in World War II, and, crucially, the design and deployment of drop tanks. Drop tanks, though initially resisted by some as an unnecessary vulnerability, were proven by analysis to be absolutely essential for extending fighter range and allowing continuous escort for bombers all the way to their targets and back. This single innovation, driven by data, fundamentally shifted the air war over Europe in favor of the Allies. For German and Japanese air forces, the increased lethality of Allied bombing raids and the stubborn resilience of bomber formations were a constant source of frustration. They observed the tightening of formations, the unexpected accuracy, and the extended range of escort fighters, but often attributed it to superior Allied production or pilot training rather than a systematic, analytical approach to warfare. The art of air combat in their eyes was increasingly being outmaneuvered by an unseen science, an optimization engine running quietly behind Allied lines. This intellectual advantage in the air war saved thousands of Allied airmen's lives and ensured the strategic bombing campaigns delivered a far more devastating blow to the Axis war machine than would have otherwise been possible. While operations research delivered its earliest and most dramatic victories in the Battle of the Atlantic, saving convoys and turning the tide against U-boats, its influence within naval strategy extended far beyond anti-submarine warfare. Both the Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy quickly realized that the scientific methodology could optimize virtually every aspect of fleet operations, from the efficient allocation of warships to the complex logistics of supplying a global force. This comprehensive application of continued to yield critical advantages, allowing Allied navies to operate with a level of efficiency and strategic foresight that frequently confounded their Axis counterparts. Optimizing ship allocation and force deployment. Naval commanders constantly grappled with how to best deploy their finite number of warships. Should a destroyer be used for convoy escort, anti-aircraft defense, or shore bombardment? Where should cruisers be positioned to best counter enemy surface raiders or provide air cover for carriers? Teams meticulously analyzed intelligence data, enemy capabilities, and operational statistics to develop sophisticated models for optimal force allocation. They used probability theory to assess risks and benefits, helping commanders make data-driven decisions on where to place precious naval assets for maximum impact and minimal vulnerability. This wasn't about intuition, it was about mathematically derived best practices for fleet deployment. Logistics of the Pacific War. In the vastness of the Pacific, where distances were immense and supply lines stretched to breaking point, or became indispensable for logistics. The sheer scale of island-hopping campaigns, supporting millions of men and thousands of ships across thousands of miles, presented unprecedented challenges. Or scientists analyzed optimal supply ship routing, identifying the most efficient routes and schedules for cargo ships to minimize transit time and fuel consumption. Port utilization, developing better methods for unloading and distributing supplies at temporary harbors and beachheads, ensuring a continuous flow of material to rapidly advancing forces. Stockpile management, determining optimal inventory levels for spare parts, ammunition, and other supplies at forward bases to prevent shortages without overstocking. Fleet train operations, optimizing the fleet train, the floating logistical support system of repair ships, oilers, and supply vessels that allowed the U.S. Navy to operate for extended periods far from major bases. This analytical approach ensured that the U.S. Navy, in particular, could project and sustain power across distances previously thought impossible, allowing for the relentless pace of operations against Japan. Mine warfare and countermeasures, or also played a crucial role in mine warfare. Scientists analyzed the effectiveness of Allied mines laid in enemy waters and, conversely, optimized countermeasures against Axis mines. They studied the probability of mine activation, the best patterns for laying mines to maximize disruption, and the most efficient sweeping techniques. Their mathematical models helped refine mine designs and deployment strategies, making both offensive and defensive mine warfare significantly more effective. Gunnery and targeting, even in established fields like naval gunnery, or provided new insights. Beyond the depth charge settings, or teams analyzed the dispersion of naval gunfire and optimized targeting procedures for various ship types and ranges. They helped develop more effective firing solutions against fast-moving targets and improved the probability of hits in challenging sea conditions. For German and Japanese naval commanders, the consistent efficiency and adaptability of the Allied navies were increasingly perplexing. They observed the resilient convoys, the unexpectedly effective anti-submarine efforts, and the ability of Allied fleets to operate at extreme ranges with sustained supply. They often attributed it to sheer industrial output or overwhelming numbers, failing to grasp the underlying methodological revolution. While they possessed advanced technology and tactical prowess, they lacked the systematic, data-driven optimization that or provided. Their approach to naval strategy remained more traditional, relying on hierarchical command and intuitive decision-making. This intellectual gap in their strategic planning continued to be a silent, yet profound, disadvantage, allowing the Allied navies to continuously refine their operations and gain an ever-increasing edge on the global oceans. One of the most profound impacts of operations research was its ability to challenge deeply ingrained assumptions and reveal counterintuitive truths, often leading to tactical and strategic changes that saved countless lives and vast quantities of material. The boffins didn't just optimize existing practices, they often overturned them, proving with hard data what traditional military thinking, reliant on intuition or anecdotal evidence, had missed. This persistent ability to find novel solutions consistently baffled Axis commanders, who were still largely operating within conventional analytical frameworks. The survivor bias and aircraft armor. Perhaps the most famous example of OR's counterintuitive genius came from the analysis of heavy bomber losses. Early in the air war, Allied bombers were suffering heavy casualties from German fighter attacks. Commanders desperately sought to reduce these losses, and one obvious solution was to add more armor to the aircraft. The question was, where to put it? Engineers, examining returning bombers, observed that the planes were riddled with bullet holes and flak damage in specific areas: the wings, the tail, and the fuselage. The intuitive conclusion was to add more armor to these heavily damaged areas. However, the statistician Abraham Wald, part of the Applied Mathematics Group at Columbia University's Statistical Research Group, which advised the AAFs or groups, famously argued precisely the opposite. Wald pointed out the flaw in the logic. The data was biased. It was based on the planes that survived. The bullet holes they observed were in areas where a plane could be hit and still make it home. Therefore, the critical areas, the ones that needed more armor, were precisely where the returning planes showed no damage: the engines, the cockpit, and the central fuselage. A hit in these areas, Wald reasoned, was likely fatal, and those planes simply didn't return to be counted in the damage reports. This profound insight, based on a careful understanding of survivor bias, fundamentally shifted armor placement. Additional plating was strategically added to the truly vulnerable, critical components, dramatically improving bomber survival rates and saving thousands of airmen's lives. It was a classic example of providing a solution that defied common sense but was irrefutably supported by data. Optimizing maintenance and reliability, beyond direct combat, also revolutionized the less glamorous but equally critical fields of maintenance and reliability. Keeping complex machinery, particularly aircraft and naval vessels, operational was a constant challenge. Early practices often involved replacing parts based on fixed operational hours or when they showed visible signs of wear. Teams, however, meticulously collected data on the failure rates of specific components. Their statistical analysis revealed that some parts exhibited a high failure rate early in their life, infant mortality, or early life failures, while others failed more frequently later in their life due to wear out. This allowed for the development of sophisticated preventative maintenance schedules based on the specific failure curves of each component, rather than generalized overhauls. For parts with high infant mortality, meticulous initial inspection and break-in periods were emphasized. For parts with predictable wear-out, scheduled replacement before failure became standard practice, preventing catastrophic breakdowns. This analytical approach significantly increased the operational readiness of Allied equipment, reduced unexpected failures in combat, and optimized the use of scarce spare parts. Aircraft spent more time flying, and ships more time patrolling, directly translating into a more effective fighting force. The life vest paradox, a simpler, yet equally effective, insight came from studying life vest usage. It was observed that many airmen who bailed out over water were not inflating their life vests until after they hit the water, leading to drownings in rough seas or due to injury. The intuitive solution was to tell airmen to inflate their vests before exiting the plane. However, teams, understanding the psychology of panicked airmen and the risk of getting stuck in the aircraft with an inflated vest, proposed a different approach. They redesigned the life vests to be automatically inflated upon pulling a cord, or even upon immersion in water. This simple, data-driven change, recognizing human behavior under stress, drastically improved survival rates. For German and Japanese military leaders, these seemingly disparate Allied successes, better bomber survival, increased equipment reliability, unexpected improvements in aircrew rescue, were bewildering. They were often attributed to vague notions of luck or overwhelming resources, rather than recognizing the profound intellectual shift occurring within the Allied command. They failed to grasp that the Allies were systematically using mathematics and statistics to extract optimal strategies from the messy realities of war, often discovering truths that directly contradicted traditional military wisdom. This reliance on data, rather than dogma, was a silent, powerful weapon that gave the Allies an unseen, decisive edge in the global conflict. The true power of operations research was not just in its individual insights, but in its ability to act as a crucial analytical layer, integrating with and amplifying the impact of new technologies and groundbreaking intelligence. As the war progressed, the Allied advantage became less about a single wonder weapon, and more about the systematic combination of these elements, all orchestrated by the data-driven insights of our teams. This synergy created a war machine of unprecedented efficiency and effectiveness, leaving Axis forces increasingly bewildered and outmatched. Optimizing radar deployment and use. Radar, a revolutionary technology for detecting enemy aircraft and ships, was a prime candidate for optimization. Early radar sets were complex and prone to errors. Teams analyzed radar operator performance, the environmental factors affecting radar signals, and the statistical probabilities of detection at various ranges and altitudes. Their work led to improved sighting, recommendations for optimal placement of radar stations to maximize coverage and minimize gaps, particularly for coastal defense and early warning. Better training, identifying common operator errors and developing training protocols to improve detection rates and reduce false alarms. Tactical integration, analyzing how radar information could be most effectively integrated into command and control systems to vector fighters or direct anti-aircraft fire, leading to faster and more lethal responses. In the Battle of the Atlantic, groups used radar performance data to identify optimal search patterns for patrol aircraft and naval escorts, ensuring that the new centimetric radar was utilized to its fullest potential in closing the mid-Atlantic gap. Intelligence amplification, ultra/SIGINT, the breaking of Axis codes, particularly the German Enigma, yielding ultra-intelligence, and Japanese codes, SIGINT, provided the Allies with an unparalleled view into enemy intentions and movements. However, this raw intelligence, while invaluable, was a massive flood of data. Operations research teams were crucial in transforming this raw intelligence into actionable strategic and tactical advice. They analyzed patterns, or used statistical analysis to identify patterns in U-boat deployment, convoy routing, or air raid planning revealed by decrypts. Predicted movements. Based on historical data and current intelligence, they developed predictive models to anticipate enemy movements, allowing convoys to be rerouted or air defenses to be prepared. Quantified risk. They could assess the probability of a U-boat attack on a specific convoy or an air raid on a particular target, helping commanders allocate resources where they were most needed. For example, when ultra-intelligence revealed a German U-boat patrol line, or would calculate the most efficient evasive maneuver for a convoy, ensuring it passed through the gaps in the U-boat line, or even through zones of high risk where escorts could be concentrated. This systematic application of intelligence, driven by or analysis, directly saved thousands of ships and lives. New weapon system effectiveness. Whenever a new weapon system was introduced, be it a new depth charge, a better bomb, or an advanced fighter, or teams were brought in to assess its effectiveness and optimize its deployment. They conducted rigorous statistical analysis of field tests and combat performance, often challenging manufacturers' claims or initial military assumptions. This ensured that new technologies were not just powerful, but were used in the most efficient and lethal way possible, maximizing their impact on the battlefield. The development of new fuses, torpedoes, and rocket artillery were all subject to or scrutiny, ensuring their deployment was tactically sound and statistically optimized. This profound synergy between operations research, new technologies, and intelligence created a self-improving, adaptive war machine. Allied commanders weren't just reacting to enemy actions, they were anticipating them, optimizing their own responses, and continuously refining their strategies based on scientific evidence. The Axis powers, still largely reliant on human intuition and less sophisticated analytical methods, found themselves increasingly outmaneuvered, their tactics becoming predictably inefficient against an enemy whose every move seemed to be guided by an unseen, mathematical precision. This quiet revolution in warfare was perhaps the most decisive, yet least visible, factor in the Allied victory, transforming the very nature of conflict. Beyond specific tactical optimizations, operations research profoundly reshaped the very process of strategic decision-making within the Allied High Command. It moved beyond the individual battlefield problem, providing tools and insights that influenced grand strategy, resource allocation, and long-term planning. This shift from purely intuitive command to data-informed leadership represented a quiet revolution, giving Allied leaders an unprecedented analytical edge that Hitler and his generals simply lacked. Resource allocation and prioritization. In a global war of attrition, every resource was precious. Commanders constantly faced agonizing choices. How many landing craft for a particular invasion? Should more steel go to tanks or ships? How should precious shipping tonnage be allocated between troops, fuel, and ammunition? Or teams developed complex models to analyze these trade-offs. By quantifying the impact of different resource allocations on overall war aims, they could provide objective data to inform these high-stakes decisions. This allowed Allied leaders to make more effective choices, ensuring that finite resources were deployed where they would achieve the maximum strategic benefit, rather than based on political pressure or departmental rivalries. Campaign planning and risk assessment. For major campaigns like D-Day, the North Africa landings, or the Pacific island hopping operations, or played a critical role in planning and risk assessment. Scientists would simulate various scenarios, analyzing the potential outcomes, casualty rates, and logistical demands of different invasion plans. They could assess the probability of success for different tactical approaches, identify critical vulnerabilities in Allied plans, and evaluate the likely impact of enemy counteractions. This rigorous, probabilistic forecasting provided commanders with a clearer understanding of the risks involved and helped them choose the optimal path forward, minimizing unnecessary losses and maximizing strategic surprise. The cost of casualties. In a grim but necessary analysis, OR also helped leaders understand the cost of casualties, not just in human terms, which was always paramount, but in terms of their impact on unit effectiveness and long-term operational capability. By analyzing historical data on troop depletion and unit degradation, they could advise on optimal rates of reinforcement, the threshold at which a unit became combat ineffective, and the best ways to integrate replacements. This ensured that manpower, a finite and precious resource, was managed as effectively as possible throughout prolonged campaigns. Bridging the gap between science and command. One of the most crucial, and often challenging, aspects of OR's influence was building trust between the scientists and the senior military commanders. Initially, many generals and admirals were skeptical of academics attempting to dictate military strategy. However, the consistent, demonstrable successes of, OR, the saved convoys, the more effective air raids, the optimized resource use, gradually eroded the skepticism. OR teams learned to communicate complex scientific findings in clear, actionable terms, providing commanders with data-driven insights that directly improved their operational performance. They became indispensable advisors, sitting in war rooms, presenting analyses that directly shaped strategic directives. For Hitler and the Axis High Command, this level of systematic, scientific analysis in strategic planning was largely absent. Their decision-making often remained centralized, top-down, and heavily influenced by the intuition and political ideologies of Hitler himself. While they had brilliant tactical commanders, the overarching strategic process lacked the rigorous, data-driven feedback loops that characterized the Allied approach. They continued to believe in the decisive power of individual genius and the will to fight, failing to comprehend that the Allies were leveraging a collective, scientific intelligence that continuously optimized their grand strategy. This intellectual disparity at the highest levels of command was a silent but profound disadvantage for the Axis. While they planned, the Allies analyzed. While they guessed, the Allies calculated probabilities. While they relied on charisma, the Allies relied on cold, hard data. Operations research didn't just win battles, it provided the framework for winning the war, giving Allied leadership an unparalleled understanding of the complex, interconnected variables that governed global conflict and enabling them to make more effective strategic choices throughout the long, arduous path to victory. While Allied war rooms buzzed with the calculations and insights of operations research teams, a starkly different reality prevailed within the Axis high commands. For Adolf Hitler and his top generals, the very concept of applying rigorous scientific and statistical analysis to tactical and strategic decision-making was largely alien, if not actively disdained. This profound intellectual blind spot proved to be one of their most significant, yet least recognized weaknesses, leading to a consistent bewilderment regarding Allied efficiency and an inability to adapt to the changing nature of modern warfare. Axis military doctrine, particularly in Germany, was heavily steeped in a tradition that viewed war as a domain of intuitive leadership, daring initiatives, and the sheer force of will. The Blitzkrieg strategy, while brilliant in its initial execution, relied on speed, surprise, and the tactical genius of commanders on the ground. Problem-solving tended to be hierarchical and experience-based. While German engineers excelled at developing advanced hardware, formidable tanks, innovative aircraft, groundbreaking rockets, they generally failed to integrate a systematic, scientific approach to operational optimization. The notion of civilian mathematicians dissecting combat data to dictate strategy was largely unthinkable, seen as an encroachment on military prerogative or simply too theoretical for the dynamic realities of the battlefield. Japanese military thinking also suffered from a similar over-reliance on traditional concepts like spiritual fortitude, individual bravery, and elaborate, often rigid, tactical plans. While they had highly skilled combatants, their approach to logistics, resource allocation, and casualty analysis often lacked the data-driven rigor that characterized Allied efforts. Their intelligence services were highly adept at collecting information, but less effective at using advanced analytical methods to predict enemy behavior or optimize their own operations. The consequences of this intellectual disparity were severe and cumulative. When Allied convoys began to survive U-boat attacks at unexpectedly high rates, German Admiral Dönitz and his commanders struggled to explain it. They blamed bad luck, new Allied detection devices, which they tried to counter with technology like METOX, often blindly, or even faulty intelligence from their own U-boats. They rarely considered that the very tactics and formations of the convoys were being optimized through statistical analysis. They saw the effects of or, but not its cause. Similarly, in the air war, German fighter pilots reported the stubborn resilience of Allied bomber formations and the unexpectedly extended range of escort fighters. They attributed this to overwhelming production capacity or sheer numerical superiority, failing to grasp that concepts like optimal combat box formations, scientifically determined armor placement, and the tactical use of drop tanks, all products of or, were fundamentally altering the survivability of Allied air fleets. Hitler himself, notoriously disdainful of anything that contradicted his intuition, exemplified this blind spot. His strategic decisions were often based on ideological conviction, personal belief, and a reliance on the decisive battle, or a wonder weapon, to turn the tide. The patient, analytical, probabilistic approach of operations research was utterly alien to his way of thinking. His bewilderment, especially regarding Allied logistical capabilities, like Pluto and Mulberry harbors, was a recurring theme in German high command meetings. He simply could not fathom how the Allies were sustaining their advances. This intellectual chasm represented a critical, silent advantage for the Allies. While the Axis poured resources into hardware and intuition-driven tactics, the Allies were systematically refining their entire warfighting process with scientific rigor. They were outthinking, not just outfighting, their enemy. The absence of a robust operations research capability meant that Axis forces were constantly making suboptimal decisions, wasting resources, and failing to adapt effectively to new challenges. They were fighting World War II with a 19th-century mindset for operational planning, while the Allies were laying the foundations for 20th-century scientific warfare. This was Hitler's profound and fatal blind spot, ensuring that no matter how brave his soldiers or how advanced his machines, his forces were ultimately outsmarted by an unseen formula of victory. The cumulative effect of operations research, working in concert with technological innovation and intelligence, was nothing less than the unseen architect of Allied victory in countless critical campaigns. While not a weapon that fired a shot or a general who led troops, or provided the vital analytical foundation that maximized the effectiveness of every Allied bullet, bomb, and strategic decision. Its impact wasn't always flashy, but it was fundamental, continuously tilting the odds in favor of the Allies and making the difference between costly stalemates and decisive breakthroughs. The Battle of the Atlantic, from bleeding to dominance. Perhaps OR's most profound and tangible impact was in the Battle of the Atlantic. The shift to larger convoys, the optimized depth charge settings, the strategic deployment of new radar-equipped aircraft, and the analytical use of ultra-intelligence were all heavily influenced by OR. These seemingly incremental improvements, when combined, transformed the battle from a desperate struggle for survival into a clear Allied dominance. OR's calculations drastically reduced shipping losses, ensuring Britain's lifeline remained open, and sealed the fate of the German U-boat arm, making Black May of 1943 a calculated extermination rather than a lucky victory. Without OR, the tonnage war would likely have been lost, and with it, the entire war in Europe. The air war, punching above their weight. In the skies over Europe and the Pacific, operations research refined Allied air power into a devastatingly efficient force. The systematic analysis of bomber formations, optimal armor placement, and the tactical deployment of long-range escort fighters, all products of OR, dramatically increased the survivability of bomber crews and the effectiveness of bombing raids. This meant that the strategic bombing campaigns could deliver a far more punishing blow to Axis industrial capacity with fewer Allied losses. OR helped ensure that every ton of bombs dropped inflicted maximum damage, and every fighter sortie provided optimal protection, effectively allowing the Allies to punch above their weight against formidable German and Japanese air defenses. Logistics of invasion and advance. The success of large-scale amphibious operations, from North Africa to D-Day and the Pacific island hopping campaigns, was underpinned by the complex planning for troop movements, equipment deployment, and especially continuous supply, as seen with Pluto and Mulberry harbors, relied heavily on models. These analyses helped allocate limited landing craft, optimize shipping routes, and ensure that the logistical tail of the invasion could support the teeth of the fighting force. Made the impossible possible, allowing armies to project power across vast oceans and sustain rapid advances deep into enemy territory, denying the Axis the opportunity to exploit anticipated logistical weaknesses. The invisible force multiplier. Ultimately, operations research acted as an invisible force multiplier across all theaters. It was not a specific piece of equipment, but a scientific method that maximized the utility of all equipment and all personnel. It meant that a limited number of destroyers could protect more merchant ships, fewer bombs could achieve greater destruction, and fewer soldiers could hold more ground. This systematic pursuit of efficiency and optimization created a continuous, adaptive learning cycle within the Allied command, allowing them to rapidly adjust to new challenges and continuously improve their warfighting capabilities. For the Axis, this scientific approach remained a profound mystery. They continued to react to Allied successes with a mixture of disbelief and frustration, often attributing them to overwhelming material superiority or sheer luck, rather than recognizing the systematic intellectual process behind them. This inability to understand or replicate Allied operations research methods meant they were always a step behind, constantly fighting a reactive battle against an enemy who possessed a silent, analytical oracle guiding their every move. The secret formula was not just a collection of equations, it was the blueprint for victory, meticulously crafted by the unseen architects in the war rooms and laboratories, fundamentally altering the strategic landscape of World War II and ensuring the eventual Allied triumph. The cumulative effect of operations research, working in concert with technological innovation and intelligence, was nothing less than the unseen architect of Allied victory in countless critical campaigns. While not a weapon that fired a shot or a general who led troops, or provided the vital analytical foundation that maximized the effectiveness of every Allied bullet, bomb, and strategic decision. Its impact wasn't always flashy, but it was fundamental, continuously tilting the odds in favor of the Allies and making the difference between costly stalemates and decisive breakthroughs. The Battle of the Atlantic, from bleeding to dominance. Perhaps OR's most profound and tangible impact was in the Battle of the Atlantic. The shift to larger convoys, the optimized depth charge settings, the strategic deployment of new radar-equipped aircraft, and the analytical use of ultra-intelligence were all heavily influenced by These seemingly incremental improvements, when combined, transformed the battle from a desperate struggle for survival into a clear Allied dominance. OR's calculations drastically reduced shipping losses, ensuring Britain's lifeline remained open, and sealed the fate of the German U-boat arm, making Black May of 1943 a calculated extermination rather than a lucky victory. Without the tonnage war would likely have been lost, and with it, the entire war in Europe. The air war, punching above their weight. In the skies over Europe and the Pacific, operations research refined Allied air power into a devastatingly efficient force. The systematic analysis of bomber formations, optimal armor placement, and the tactical deployment of long-range escort fighters, all products of dramatically increased the survivability of bomber crews and the effectiveness of bombing raids. This meant that the strategic bombing campaigns could deliver a far more punishing blow to Axis industrial capacity with fewer Allied losses. Helped ensure that every ton of bombs dropped inflicted maximum damage, and every fighter sortie provided optimal protection, effectively allowing the Allies to punch above their weight against formidable German and Japanese air defenses. Logistics of invasion and advance. The success of large-scale amphibious operations, from North Africa to D-Day and the Pacific island hopping campaigns, was underpinned by the complex planning for troop movements, equipment deployment, and especially continuous supply, as seen with Pluto and Mulberry harbors, relied heavily on models. These analyses helped allocate limited landing craft, optimize shipping routes, and ensure that the logistical tail of the invasion could support the teeth of the fighting force. Made the impossible possible, allowing armies to project power across vast oceans and sustain rapid advances deep into enemy territory, denying the Axis the opportunity to exploit anticipated logistical weaknesses. The invisible force multiplier. Ultimately, operations research acted as an invisible force multiplier across all theaters. It was not a specific piece of equipment, but a scientific method that maximized the utility of all equipment and all personnel. It meant that a limited number of destroyers could protect more merchant ships, fewer bombs could achieve greater destruction, and fewer soldiers could hold more ground. This systematic pursuit of efficiency and optimization created a continuous, adaptive learning cycle within the Allied command, allowing them to rapidly adjust to new challenges and continuously improve their warfighting capabilities. For the Axis, this scientific approach remained a profound mystery. They continued to react to Allied successes with a mixture of disbelief and frustration, often attributing them to overwhelming material superiority or sheer luck, rather than recognizing the systematic intellectual process behind them. This inability to understand or replicate Allied operations research methods meant they were always a step behind, constantly fighting a reactive battle against an enemy who possessed a silent, analytical oracle guiding their every move. The secret formula was not just a collection of equations, it was the blueprint for victory, meticulously crafted by the unseen architects in the war rooms and laboratories, fundamentally altering the strategic landscape of World War II and ensuring the eventual Allied triumph.